In June 2011, the body of 71-year-old Richard Holloway was found in his home office in Charleston, South Carolina. At first, it appeared to be a brutal murder, but as investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a web of lies spanning 4 decades. An investigation revealed a shocking double life, a secret relationship stretching back to 1971, and a carefully orchestrated plan for revenge. In June 2011, at the Holloway estate on Chesapeake Lane, a chain of events began to unravel, a series of betrayals and hidden truths that would shock an entire community and destroy a family forever. At 6:12 a.m., when the call came through, the dispatcher immediately recognized the distress in the woman's voice. Margaret Holloway, a well-known figure in Charleston's upper-class circles, was hysterical. Her words tumbled out in disjointed fragments, her breathing ragged, as if she had been running or gasping for air between sobs. The dispatcher tried to calm her, asking her to slow down, to repeat the address, to check if her husband was still breathing, but all she could do was repeat the same frantic phrases. He was on the floor. There was blood. He wasn't moving. By the time the first patrol unit pulled up to the Holloway estate, the early morning fog had barely begun to lift. The mansion was silent, its towering brick walls shielding whatever horror lay inside. The responding officers stepped out cautiously, scanning the manicured lawn, the white columned entrance, the heavy oak door that stood ajar. The house was still, too still, as if it were holding its breath. Inside they found Margaret standing near the staircase, her body visibly shaking, one hand gripping the banister so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Her face was pale, almost grey, her normally perfect blonde hair a tangled mess over her shoulders. She didn't speak right away. She didn't need to. Her eyes, wide and unfocused, darted toward the study at the end of the hall. The officers followed her gaze. As soon as they stepped inside, the weight of the scene hit them like a solid wall. Richard Holloway, 71 years old, was dead. He was slumped over his desk, his arms hanging limp, the lower half of his body twisted slightly in the chair. A pool of dried blood had settled beneath him, the deep red staining the polished hardwood floor. His head tilted unnaturally to one side, the back of his skull partially caved in, the blood matted into his once perfectly combed silver hair. A second wound, smaller but just as violent, marred his right temple, as if he had been struck twice. The room smelled wrong. Yes, there was blood, but there was also something else, a faint chemical scent beneath the metallic tang in the air. A bottle of bourbon sat on the desk, a glass tipped over beside it, its contents long spilled. At first glance, it could have been dismissed as an accident, an old man drinking too much, falling, hitting his head. But Detective Elliot Carter, who had just arrived on the scene, took one look and knew better. The blood wasn't where it should be. It had settled too perfectly, too conveniently, almost as if it had been placed there deliberately. There was no smeared trail, no evidence of a struggle, nothing that suggested Richard Holloway had fought for his life. And yet, the injuries said otherwise. As officers moved to secure the house, Margaret Holloway remained frozen, watching them move around her as if her mind had shut down. One of the officers gently guided her to sit down, placing a blanket over her shoulders, but she barely reacted. Her breathing was shallow, her hands shaking as she whispered something under her breath, too low for anyone to hear. It wasn't until 7:15 a.m. that the paramedics officially confirmed what everyone already knew. Richard was gone. By 8:30 a.m., the crime scene unit had arrived, the once peaceful Holloway home now filled with officers, detectives, forensic specialists, all trying to piece together what had happened here. By 9:45 a.m., the medical examiner began his preliminary assessment. and within minutes it was clear this was no accident. At 11:20 a.m., the autopsy confirmed it. Richard Holloway had been murdered. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the skull, the first blow knocking him unconscious, the second ensuring he wouldn't wake up. But that wasn't all. The toxicology report revealed traces of a sedative in his bloodstream, a controlled substance, something that wouldn't have been in his system unless someone put it there. By June 16th, detectives had only one suspect, Margaret Holloway. She was the only one home. The only one who could have done it. But Detective Carter wasn't convinced. Something didn't sit right. The crime scene was too clean, too perfect, as if someone had taken their time setting the stage. And by June 18th, everything changed, because Richard Holloway had secrets. And his wife wasn't the only woman in his life. On the morning of June 14th, 2011, Margaret Holloway felt something was off before she even opened her eyes. The house was too quiet. Normally, she would hear the faint sound of Richard moving around, his steady footsteps in the hallway, the creak of his study chair as he settled in with his morning coffee. But that day, there was nothing. She turned over in bed, reaching instinctively toward his side, empty. The sheets were cool. He hadn't been there for hours, maybe all night. By 6:12 a.m., her life had already begun to unravel. When the police took Margaret's statement later that day, she tried to explain everything logically. She told them about their routine, about how Richard was often up before her, how he sometimes fell asleep at his desk after long nights of research or grading papers. But her voice wavered when she admitted that things had been different lately. He had been distant, more than usual. Margaret had spent the last 40 years convincing herself that this was just how marriage worked. Richard had always been busy. He had taken frequent business trips, had long office hours, and attended academic conferences that she had stopped asking about years ago. He had been a good provider, a man respected by his peers. Their life had been built on stability, and Margaret had accepted stability as love. But in the last few months, something had changed. By April 2011, Richard had become restless. His business trips were more frequent. He was checking his phone constantly, always stepping out of the room when it rang. He had started locking his study door, something he had never done before. Margaret noticed, but she had trained herself not to pry. But on June 14th, after the police took her statement and left her alone in the house, she couldn't stop herself. By 10:30 a.m., she walked into his study, the same room where he had been found dead. The air was thick, as if it still held onto the moment of his death. The scent of his cologne mixed with the faint, lingering smell of bourbon and old paper. She traced her fingers along his desk, the polished wood still sticky with dried blood in some places. That was when she saw it. At first, it seemed like nothing, just an old key, tucked away in the corner of his drawer, hidden beneath a stack of neatly arranged papers. It was small, worn from use, but it didn't belong to anything in their home. Her breath quickened, her hands trembled. She knew better than to ignore it. By 11:45 a.m., she had torn through the desk, through every compartment, every locked drawer. And that was when she found the second phone. It wasn't like his regular phone. This one was cheap, outdated, the kind people bought when they didn't want to be tracked. It was tucked away at the back of the drawer, hidden under old receipts and forgotten notes from years ago. When she pressed the power button, the screen lit up instantly. A flood of missed calls, all from the same number. She didn't recognize it, but then she opened the messages. The last one, sent at 11:42 p.m. on June 13th, just hours before his death, made her stomach drop. "We can't keep doing this, Richard. She's going to find out." By 2 p.m., the police had already traced the number. By 4:15 p.m., they had a name: Eleanor Grayson, a 58-year-old retired librarian living 30 miles away. By June 15th, detectives had driven out to question her. What they discovered next changed everything. The name meant nothing to Margaret at first. She had never met an Eleanor Grayson. She had never even heard of her. But for Eleanor, the name Margaret Holloway had defined her entire life. By June 16th, after hours of questioning, Eleanor could no longer hold back the truth. She had been in a relationship with Richard Holloway for 40 years. 40 years! The exact length of his marriage to Margaret. They had met in 1971, the same year Richard and Margaret got married. The same year they built their life together. Eleanor had never married, never had children. She had spent her entire life waiting for Richard, believing that one day he would finally choose her. Through tears, Eleanor described their relationship to the investigators. She told them how Richard had made promises. How, year after year, he swore he was going to leave Margaret, that it was just a matter of timing. She believed him. Every time. By the 1980s, he had bought her a house, a place where they could be together in secret. By the 1990s, he had spent more time with her than with Margaret. By the 2000s, Eleanor had stopped asking when he would leave his wife. She had stopped believing that he ever would. And by 2011, she had finally had enough. For decades, Eleanor had been invisible. She had loved him in the shadows, accepted the quiet loneliness, convinced herself that this was still better than not having him at all. But after 40 years, the weight of that emptiness had become unbearable. By June 13th, 2011, the night before Richard was murdered, she had sent him one final message. "We can't keep doing this, Richard. She's going to find out." By June 14th, she was sitting in a police station, tears streaming down her face as she finally admitted what she had been too afraid to say for 40 years. Richard had never intended to leave Margaret. Everything had been a lie, but the real question was, had Eleanor finally realized it too late? Or had she been the one to end it? By June 18th, 2011, the Charleston Police Department was no closer to identifying the killer. The evidence was confusing, the motives too many, and the crime scene too perfect. The first suspect was Margaret Holloway, the wife who had given 40 years of her life to a man who had been lying to her from the start. She had every reason to want him dead. Betrayal, rage, revenge. But Margaret had never been violent, even when she had discovered the secret phone, even when she had read that final message from another woman. She hadn't confronted Richard. She hadn't even cried. Instead, she had sat in his study for hours after the police left, staring at the blood-stained floor, unable to move. Her grief was real. That much was clear. But was it the grief of a heartbroken wife, or the guilt of a woman who had finally snapped? Then there was Eleanor Grayson, the woman Richard had been seeing in secret for 40 years. A woman who had spent her entire adult life waiting for a future that was never going to come. Eleanor had built a life around his promises, had given up everything for him, only to be tossed aside like she had never mattered at all. Her final message to Richard, sent just hours before he died, told the police everything they needed to know. She had reached her breaking point. But Eleanor was not a violent person. When the detectives questioned her again on June 19th, she barely had the strength to speak. Her hands trembled. Her eyes were swollen from crying. She hadn't left her house in days. Could she have been capable of killing the man she loved? Or was there someone else? By June 21st, 2011, the case took an unexpected turn. A new name appeared in the investigation: Daniel Holloway, Richard's oldest son. At 38 years old, Daniel had spent most of his life living in his father's shadow. He had never quite measured up. Not in academics, not in career, not in anything that mattered to Richard. Where his father had been respected, intelligent, powerful, Daniel had been the disappointment. He had dropped out of college, failed at 3 different businesses, and was now working as a freelance consultant, a title that meant nothing and paid even less. And by June 7th, 2011, just 1 week before Richard was murdered, Daniel had secretly taken out a $250,000 life insurance policy on his father. The timing was too perfect. At first, the police had barely looked at Daniel. He had seemed genuinely shocked when he heard about his father's death. His alibi had checked out. He had been at a business meeting at 7 a.m. on the morning of the murder, an hour after Margaret's frantic 911 call. But now, the detectives had to ask a different question. Had Daniel planned this? By June the 22nd, 2011, the detectives sat across from him in the interrogation room. The atmosphere was different now. The moment he walked in, they noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way he sat too stiffly, as if he was trying too hard to appear relaxed. The questioning started slow. Routine inquiries about his relationship with his father, his financial situation, his knowledge of the affair. He answered everything carefully, with measured control, but when they brought up the insurance policy, something shifted. Daniel had tried to act surprised. He had denied everything at first, claiming it was a coincidence, that it was just smart financial planning. But the detectives knew better. The records told a different story. Daniel had been struggling financially for years. His credit cards were maxed out, his business debts were piling up. He had missed mortgage payments on his home in Atlanta, and 2 weeks before his father's death, he had taken out a $250,000 policy on the man who had never respected him. By June 24th, forensic accountants confirmed what the detectives had suspected all along. Daniel had been on the verge of losing everything. His business was failing, his creditors were closing in, and the only thing standing between him and financial ruin was his father's death. But had he killed Richard? There was one problem. There was no evidence linking Daniel to the crime scene. No fingerprints, no DNA, no witnesses placing him near the house. Nothing. By June 25th, 2011, the case had become more than just about infidelity. It was bigger than one affair. It was about greed, deception, and betrayal. 3 suspects, 3 different motives. The grieving wife who had wasted 40 years of her life on a lie. The mistress who had sacrificed everything for a man who was never going to choose her. And the son who stood to gain the most from his father's death. By June 27th, the detectives had to ask themselves one final question. Who was lying, and who was willing to kill for the truth? By July 2nd, 2011, Charleston police had spent nearly a month unraveling the most twisted case of their careers. Every theory had fallen apart, every lead had led them somewhere darker, and every suspect had seemed guilty, but not guilty enough. Margaret Holloway had rage and betrayal, but no evidence tied her to the murder. Eleanor Grayson had heartbreak and bitterness, but she had no way to get into the house that night. Daniel Holloway had greed and desperation, but he was in Atlanta at the time of the crime. Yet Richard Holloway was still dead, and it wasn't until forensic toxicologists completed their final report on July 2nd that the truth finally came to light. The results shocked everyone, not because of what they found, but because of who they found it in. The poison had been in Richard Holloway's own bloodstream, a rare toxin, one commonly linked to suicides, nearly undetectable without specific testing, the kind of poison someone intelligent, calculated and methodical would use, the kind of poison that didn't kill instantly, but rather gave the illusion of a natural death, unless someone looked closer. The crime scene had always seemed staged. Now they knew why. Richard had killed himself. But it wasn't just suicide. It was a performance. It had been planned down to the last detail, as carefully as one of his academic lectures, as deliberately as the double life he had kept hidden for 40 years. He had known exactly what would happen after his death. He had counted on it. By the time investigators uncovered his final, handwritten confession, the truth was already clear. Richard Holloway had orchestrated the entire thing. Every clue had been left deliberately, every detail carefully arranged. He had spent decades lying, and now, even in death, he was still controlling the narrative. In the letter, he admitted everything. He had lived 2 lives for 4 decades, keeping 2 women trapped in an endless cycle of hope and deception. He had manipulated his wife into complacency, convinced his mistress to waste her life waiting, and had never planned on changing any of it. But by June 13th, 2011, the walls had started to close in. Eleanor was no longer willing to stay in the shadows. She had sent him that final message, the words that made it clear she was done believing him. Margaret had found the key, had seen the secret phone, had finally started asking questions, and Daniel, his own son, had bet his life on Richard's death. Richard had always been in control. His entire life had been about power, authority, and manipulation. He couldn't bear the thought of losing that. So he had decided to take the power back in the only way left to him. He would kill himself. But he wouldn't just die. He would make them all suffer. Margaret, the wife who had trusted him, would become the prime suspect. She would spend weeks under police scrutiny, her life falling apart around her. The perfect Southern wife dragged through the dirt, her reputation in ruins. Eleanor, the woman who had wasted decades loving him, would be forced to confront the truth that she had never mattered to him at all, that he had never planned to choose her. And Daniel, the son who had never been enough, would think he had won, only to lose everything. By July 3rd, 2011, the case was officially closed. Margaret Holloway was cleared of all charges, but it didn't matter. The damage was done. By July 10th, she had moved out of the Charleston mansion. It had been her home for 40 years, the place where she had raised her children, where she had believed she was loved. Now, it was a house full of ghosts. She was no longer the woman she had been before. Society didn't forgive easily. The whispers followed her everywhere. The suspicion never fully went away. People looked at her and saw not a grieving widow, but a woman who might have gotten away with murder. By July 15th, Eleanor Grayson was gone. She had packed up her entire life in less than a week. No one knew where she had gone. She had spent 40 years waiting for Richard Holloway, building her life around his empty promises. But the moment he was gone, she realized there was nothing left of her own life. She had given everything to a man who had never planned to give her anything in return. By August 3rd, Daniel Holloway was in handcuffs. His father had outplayed him in the cruelest way possible. He had taken out a $250,000 insurance policy on his father, believing it would be his way out of debt. But Richard had died by suicide, making the claim invalid. When investigators dug deeper, they found fraud, unpaid loans, and falsified financial documents. By August 21st, Daniel was sentenced to 5 years in prison for insurance fraud. Everything Richard had built, his family, his reputation, his entire legacy, was in ruins. And yet, in some twisted way, he had gotten exactly what he wanted. No one had won. By September 2011, Richard Holloway's name had become a ghost story in Charleston. People whispered about the professor who had lived 2 lives, the man who had been so obsessed with control that he carried it beyond the grave. His house sat empty, an eerie reminder of the life he had destroyed. His name became a cautionary tale, a lesson in deception, greed, and the cost of betrayal. And in the end, the only thing left of Richard Holloway's perfect life was the wreckage he had left behind.
Make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on our daily updates, and you can check out another insane case we have, the case where a preacher's secret visit to ladies of pleasure leads to murder. Make sure to check it out and let us know your thoughts in the comment section.